Hello and welcome to the Edify Podcast. This is designed for you, preacher, teacher, shepherd, deacon of the kingdom of God, for your edification, for your uplifting, for your ministry. Hello, servant of God. This is our introductory podcast episode. Kind of want to give you direction of where we're going with this podcast as you devote time to this. This isn't going to be one of those 1 hour podcasts. You know, we may have special segments or something like that, interviews, but this is something for you on a weekly basis to build you up. You know, and so much has been said about helping the servant of God, but nobody really ministers to the minister. In your local work, you have to find ways to be edified. A lot of times you're dealing with people who don't understand that you need to be ministered to, that you need to be preached to, you need to be served. And when you're the one who is doing all of the giving all of the time, that can become very tiresome and you burn out. I want to look at Moses as we begin just this thought for the day about burnout and helping you as you edify the church in whatever capacity that is, you know, preacher, teacher, elder, deacon, missionary. But it was said that the psalmist said in Psalms 106:33 that Moses had used rash words when he got mad. In plain terms, Moses got mad, and it caused him to lash out at those who had hurt him. And what it did was it led him to dishonor God, who had helped him and strengthened him and shown him so many things. But we asked the question, how did that happen? Because it happens to us. But how does it happen, you know, in a logical sense? If you look at Moses, he had been faithful for so many decades. I mean, so many decades. But something had happened. Just his kettle whistled, and that was it. And he behaved in such a way that it cost him. And you certainly don't want to act out sometimes what you're feeling. And sometimes we have to bite our tongue, our lips, and pray in those stressful times. And there has been a lot written and said about, you know, about people leaving the ministry within the first 5 years. When research has been done across the, quote, Christendom board, about 30% of folks in the United States leave preaching and full-time ministry within the first 5 years. And that's a high rate. When I think about those who graduated with me at Memphis, there was probably 23 in our graduating class that year, maybe a little less. But I think only 3 or 4 of us, maybe 5, are preaching now. And there were a couple of guys who were there who didn't want to preach full time, but wanted to be good elders, and that was commendable. But why? Why are they dropping like flies? You know, not just preachers, but even teachers. It can be hard to find Bible class teachers. It can be hard to be a Bible class teacher because you feel like you're sitting in front of people who don't care what you say, who aren't going to do what you've studied so much about, you know, this past week that you've been wanting to share with them. And you can become burnt out. And besides, if you are, you know, a deacon, elder, preacher, teacher, especially if you're paid in a paid position, you're expected to work, you know, long hours in declining congregations. Some of you, not all of us, but some of you are in that situation with, you know, finances that are dwindling, where there's a weak amount of commitment. Apathy is all around. There's low biblical literacy in the house, and there's really no staff. I mean, you may be the only, quote, staff there. And, you know, that pressure is there. And it creates, you know, unbearable workloads. And even though workloads cause fatigue, and fatigue is a factor, there's a lot more to consider in fatigue. Fatigue leads us to places. Workload isn't the issue as so much as it is the heart load. There can be a sense of I'm not appreciated, that I do so much for this congregation, but they don't care. Nobody says anything. Nobody uplifts me. Nobody edifies me. And maybe you're blamed. Not only do they not say anything good, but then they say everything bad. And in Moses' case, here was a guy who gave himself to God and God's people. And he was in the wilderness. He wasn't at home, and he journeyed, and that lasted about half a century. I mean, 40 years. And he faces a congregation in that 40-year time in his ministry that they were rebellious, and they were going to die in that wilderness because of their rebellion. And of course, they blamed him. Why have you brought us out here? Why have you brought, quote, the assembly of the Lord, into this place, that we should die here, and we don't have fruits and pomegranates, and we had it better where we were, and why have you made us come up out of here, and all this sort of stuff. But see, it's not just fatigue that leads to failure. There is frustration. Workloads can increase as one who steps out in the limelight, preacher, teacher, elder, deacon. You are an easy target. You're having to, or you're being compared to other people. If you're a preacher, you might be, compared to, well, they're not this kind of preacher. They're not this kind of preacher. They're not a great communicator. They tell good stories, but their spiritual meat is lacking. And church, if we're not careful, it can become about consumerism, where people are, church hoppers, and they're looking for what fits them the best. And even though that's in the world, it's infiltrated the ranks of the church, and you're not gauged for your faithfulness, you're gauged for your effectiveness. And maybe you have said this before, I know I have, where there's pressure, that you can feel guilty if you sit down. Maybe you've said that before. If I don't work, I feel bad. I feel like nothing's going to get done. And fatigue, it sets up in our heart, but what fatigue does is it brings anger. Tiredness is not usually just really the sufficient reason why preachers leave, or quit the work altogether, or elders step down, or deacons step down. Most of the time, it's just because of tiredness and anger, where they feel underappreciated, or their work isn't going the way that they think it should go. And so you have to fight fatigue and fight the tiredness, fight the anger, fight the energy, the negative energy that's coming from people who don't seem to care, and you're tired. And what can happen is, in those moments, and this is how the devil does this, we can shoulder, really, really heavy loads that have been imposed on us by other people. And if we're not careful, we'll hear our heart whisper, "How dare they?" Where I sacrifice so much of myself and so much of my time and so much of my family, and you begin to wonder why other people do not do that for you. And we can minister so much out of ourselves and our appreciation for Christ and what He's done, but then if we're not careful, we'll look to ourselves and say, you know what? Look at all that I've done, and they don't appreciate me. And see, in that moment, I've got to understand, Jake, your heart's not right. Your heart is not right where you are. That is a sinful thought. If you look at the overall picture, Christ is the one who continues to pour Himself out to the world, that as a fire hydrant, it just spews water out into the ground, and it's somewhat wasted. But to those of us who are saved, it's the power of God. Paul told the Corinthian church. It's worth it to us. And in your congregations, there are people who need you, and they may not say it, but they're praying for you. I don't know where I would be without the little old widow ladies in the congregation who are praying for me, and who tell me that they're praying for me, and that they need us here, and all those sorts of things. What I'm asking you to do in this podcast is to look at your heart clearly, unflinchingly. What's there? What is residing in my own heart? Why am I tired? Why do I have a negative view toward the church and the work and preaching or ministry in any kind of way? it is true that there are times we feel isolated and overworked and underappreciated, and we're fearing, especially for those of us who are gainfully employed, for congregations where we're fearing failure or embarrassment or conflict, whatever it is. Or maybe you know the pain of personal attack and the pressures to succeed, and those disappointments from people and their expectations, or their expectation on my wife, who's not employed here, but yet she's looked at differently. There are times where we need the counsel of good, godly men. I certainly don't have it all figured out, but what I want to do in this podcast is work this out for myself, work this out for you, be a confidant for you. Let this podcast be a place where you can go and breathe and vent and hear the truth that you need to hear, but at the same time be edified. That's the direction going forward. One of my co-preachers here on the preaching staff at Piedmont Road is David Decker. And David serves as the director of the Georgia School of Preaching. And he's traveled all over the state of Georgia and really all over the place with House to House and Polishing the Pulpit. And GSOPonline.org is where you can find any information for stuff like that. But I was having a pretty tired burnout spell about year four of the ministry for myself, and I was just pretty beat. And I called him up one day as somebody who's a very seasoned veteran preacher, and I was just telling him where I was. And he said, Jake, I had a conversation with a gentleman about the same amount of time in my first work. He said, and this gentleman was a preacher, an older preacher. He said, if I said his name, you would know it. And he said, I just asked him if he could be a confidant for me for just the moment. He said, well, sure. And he said, I feel like the church here needs a new preacher. I feel like I've done all that I can do. I've, exercised everything that I know how to do. Things aren't working. It's not moving, the direction's slow or whatever it was. And he said, I just feel like that they need a new preacher. And he said the older preacher just kind of mulled it over for just a minute. And he said, well, give them a new preacher. And he thought, well, I guess he's asking me to leave, but he said, no, what I mean is give them a new preacher, somebody who does things differently. Change your habits, change your focus, change your attention, change the way you delegate, change your prayer life, all those sorts of things. And that's what David relayed to me, and now he and I work together here at Piedmont Road. And but wherever you are, you can feel wore out, and you can feel as though nobody ministers to the minister. And for the most case, you're right. You're right. But God ministers. Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 14, Christ sends his angels as ministering spirits to those who are inheriting salvation. Preachers, teachers, elders, deacons are on that list. What does that look like? What all is involved with Jesus sending his angels that I can't see, this providential realm? I don't know what's all involved. I just know that he does it, and I'm thankful. This podcast will cause you to look at your heart. Look at the reasons as to why you're involved in the ministry itself, what's going to keep you going. Because I promise, if you're looking at results, if you're concerning yourself with the fruit of the work and not the root of the work, which is Jesus, you will become tired and burn out. You will quit. You will quit the work. You may quit the church. You may find it too unbearable to continue and walk with people that God has called us through and called us to in his scriptures. And so it's our prayer that this podcast will help you and help your heart and help you edify as you edify the church.